Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Today we do something fun and ultimately meaningless. We're going to be looking at which specs currently, given the best possible situation, given they use their potion, their racial, all of their cooldowns, inside of Bloodlust, fighting a near stationary target, in this case Guardian of the first ones, and how much damage they are going to have at the end of this burst window. Yeah, some people are going to argue the meaning of burst. To some people burst is 5 seconds, to some people is 10, to others is 15. You know, it kind of depends on the duration of your own cooldowns, right? But in this case, we are going to be looking at Bloodlust. Right, just Bloodlust. The very important, usually what is being used as the most important part of the phase when it comes to damage for the encounter. That's why you put your Bloodlust in. So, we are looking at who is doing better in this scenario. We might be looking at eventually even at shorter windows, right? 10 to 15 seconds to give some props to the specs that also do very well in that short of a window. Now, when you look at this larger 30 to 40 second window, you have to point out a couple of things. The thing number one is that you could divide very easily, split the DPSers in 3 sections, because the DPS they can reach can be above the 16,000 DPS mark. It can be somewhat in between the 14 to 16,000, maybe even 13 to 16,000. They can fluctuate in there. And then there is the bottom half, which is the ones that are sitting in the 11 to 14,000 DPS mark. So let's start by looking at the outlier, the one who is at the top, who is so at the top that doesn't even make it into this category, which is Balanced Druid. Venthyr, specifically Venthyr Balanced Druid. Because while all of the other specs have to be counted with a ruler, trying to precisely count how much damage they are having on average, Balanced Druid is just above all that. Venthyr Balanced Druid inside of Bloodlust can reach 24, 25, 26, some even 27,000 DPS. This is legitimately twice as much DPS as many other specs we're going to be seeing. And it's not a 5-second burst. It's not like saying, well, you know, in Season 1, Fire Mage during Combustion could double the DPS of some other spec. And you will be like, yeah, sure. You know, it's Combustion. It's like 8, 10 seconds long, whatever. This is Bloodlust. You know, this is 40 seconds. This is an entire pretty big window. And Balanced Druids can double the DPS of roughly half of the specs we're going to go over today. So that is impressive to say the least, and overpowered to say the most. After Balanced Druid, we have 2 to 3, you can say, other specs that are very, very high and are above the pack, above the rest. 1 inch. By inch, I mean 1,000 or so, 1,500, sometimes 2,000 more DPS than the rest. That is pretty high. And that's, first of all, Unholy Death Knight. Unholy Death Knight can average in the 16 to 18,000 DPS range in this burst window. They are not one of the specs that can benefit for the full 40 seconds of Bloodlust. They are one of the specs that could do with a little bit shorter of a window if we wanted to look at their damage. But even in this longer of a window, they are still amongst the highest DPS players when it comes to single target damage, with all of their cooldowns and potions and trinkets and racials available to them. The other spec that is very close to Unholy, still pretty far from Balance, but as I mentioned, we can't use it as a means of comparison because it's just way too far off. The other one is Shadow Priest. Shadow Priest also is getting above 16,000 DPS more often than not. It also gets to 17 and in some cases 18,000 DPS in the Bloodlust window. This is more important because Shadow Priest doesn't have a particularly strong, cornerstone DPS cooldown like Wings or Combustion, or in the case of Venthyr, Balanced Druid Venthyr, for example, something like Ravenous Frenzy. They just have a much higher consistent damage. The other one that is a little bit surprising that makes it higher than the rest, is Marksmanship Hunter. So, Marksmanship Hunter, needs to be said, is, in this case, the Night Fae Marksmanship Hunter. The reason why it needs to be said is because there are, a few more, so to speak, Kyrian hunters, players going Kyrian to play Hunter, but Night Fae is still the one that provides the most burst, at the very least inside a single window. So Marksmanship Hunters can get to 16 to 17 and to even 18, and in some rare cases even 19,000 DPS burst in the Bloodlust window. As you know, it's not that Marksmanship Hunter has some super powerful burst, particularly in single target. They do still have being Night Fae, they have Wild Spirits, And then they have True Shot. They don't have much else, but they can have a pretty surprisingly high burst DPS in single target as well. It's of course going to be higher in AoE. We might even go over the burst when it comes to AoE, but even in single target they are respectable. Their problem, more so than single target, is the sustain damage, is what happens after they don't have their cooldowns anymore. That is what is pulling them down a little bit more. Now, this was the top half. These were the DPS that would be able to reach above 18,000 DPS in this Bloodlust window with everything available to them. Then there is the one below, between the 13 and 16,000 range. But first, let's go over the disappointing, slow bottom of the pack, the ones that are sitting in the 11 to 12 to 13,000 DPS range, not really doing much as a burst damage window. I wanted to go there because it is worth remembering, everyone, that burst damage, quick damage, or increased damage in short periods of time is not everything to a raid boss. Very often it's going to be required. Very often there are going to be phases where an ad is spawning and you just want to get away with it quickly, so you will need this type of damage profile, but it's not that it's all that matters. For example, if we look at the popularity of the specs right now, or even the performance of the specs right now, in this bottom half of specs without too much of an exciting window of heavy damage, we can see that Havoc, Arms, Assassination, and Destruction, for example, are all in this category. This is a category of specs that are fluctuating between the low end of 10 to 11,000 DPS and then the high end of 13 and in some rare cases even 14,000 DPS, but it's much more rare. Usually they sit at 12 to 13. That's the state of all of these specs. You know, the blob, the so-called blob, which is usually going to look like this. You will see Windwalker, Destruction, you will see something like Arcane, you will see Elemental Shamans there, you will see all of the rogue specs. Outlaw, Assassination, and Subtlety will all be in here, and that's more or less what you can expect from their damage in this window. You know, 13, 12,000 DPS, somewhere around there. Some of these specs have a damage profile which will be more powerful in a, 15-ish second window, in a shorter cooldown range. Arcane Mage is an example of that. Windwalker is also an example of that, even to some degree, even Outlaw Rogue. So in a longer window, in a Bloodlust situation, they are sitting in the bottom half, so to speak. We left the lowest of the low for later. Now we go back to the upper side, the upper pack. These are the specs that can't quite reach 17 to 18 to 19 even thousand DPS in this window of damage, but they're still doing better than the rest. They are still distinguishing themselves for having better than average damage. So the other one not mentioned in here is Demonology Warlock. Demonology Warlock, of course, has a very, we can call technical setup in its cooldowns, because they have to pull out all of their pets before they can get to pull out their Demonic Tyrant. Is also another one of the specs that can do better in a 15 or so second window, basically as long as their Tyrant is alive. That's the window they want to have their damage counted on. A Bloodlust window is 40 seconds long, Tyrant is not going to last half of that, so it's still impressive that they can keep up in the higher side of burst, even with a window of damage so long. They can still get to 15 to 16, even to 17,000 DPS in some cases, so they are bridging the gap. They can break the 15 to 16,000 DPS quite easily when it comes to this burst window, so they make it towards the top. The other one that makes it towards the top is the little brother of Unholy Death Knight, which is Frost. So Frost, not really played as much, not really considered as much as Unholy. Unholy itself has not been considered as much compared to the start of the expansion, but definitely still way more than Frost. Frost can also have some decent burst in this Bloodlust window. They can often stay above 15,000 DPS, and they can also get, in the higher cases, at 16 or so. So they make it past the 14,000 or so DPS barrier. Another spec that is going to make it past this 14,000 barrier is Enhancement Shaman. Enhancement Shaman is towards the lower end, though. They have a little bit more trouble to get past that barrier, but they can get past it. Not just 14, but even 15,000 DPS in this window can be reached by Enhancement Shamans. This is the Enhancement Shaman build with Witch Doctor's Wolfbones, which is the build centered around your Feral Spirits with the Feral Spirits talent. So your burst window, your big cooldown is going to be available. The other build, which is the Doom Winds build, is a little bit weaker if you want to look at a single instance of burst, because Doom Winds is going to be available every minute and give you a pretty steady, consistent DPS, whereas this one is more centered around your bigger cooldown, your Feral Spirits, which can give you some pretty good DPS in this window. The other spec is Retribution. I mean, it would be pretty sad if Retribution didn't make it in here. Given all of the cooldowns at their disposal that they can use for this precise reason, this burst window, it would be pretty sad if they couldn't even make it, right? They have to set up their execution sentence and their Seraphim and their final reckoning and their wings, and then all these buttons just to do the same single target damage as a Destro lock. That would feel kind of bad. So yes, their damage can be pretty good. Inside this window they can get to 14 and even 15,000 DPS damage as well. Similar to other specs in this range, 14 to 15 is the top average, and then they can get in some cases to 16. So it's similar to Announcement and similar to Frost Decay in this case, and it is also similar to the last spec we will be looking at in here, which is Feral Druid. Feral Druid is getting bailed out. I've been saying this since the start of the expansion. Feral Druid still has quite a few problems, but for now has been bailed out by Convoke the Spirits. Convoke the Spirits gives them quite good burst, so they can do very well in this window. Feral Druid is also pretty stable, solid, consistent single target damage. The thing that makes the difference here with Feral is that they can stay at 15, 13, 14, 15, 16,000 DPS like the other ones mentioned. The main difference with the build, similar to what we pointed out with Announcement, is that the higher logs, the higher performance in this burst window is given by Drought of Deep Focus, because right now Feral Druid has quite a few options in their legendaries, one of which is Celestial Spirits. The benefit of Celestial Spirits is that it gives you more Convoke the Spirits. It means you can use them more often. But of course, in the context of a single Bloodlust window, it's going to be weaker, because you can still just use one of them, and it's also 25% shorter. So basically, you're not really doing anything. If anything, you're getting nerfed for this short window compared to Drought of Deep Focus, which just straight up buffs your Moonfire Rake Rip by 40% on a single target. So with this legendary, the consistent damage inside of Bloodlust for Feral is getting significantly higher compared to the other build they're going for. Now, after we have gone to the top side, which is Balance, Unholy, Shadow Priest, Marksmanship, and then Demonology, and a little bit lower down, Ret, Frost, Feral, and Enhancement, we also went in the middle. This middle, muddy pack of Havoc, Windwalker, Arcane, Subtlety, Assassination, Destruction, Outlaw, etc., etc. One I left out is Arms Warrior. Arms Warrior, of course, lives and dies. Technically, yeah, I should mention Fury as well. They both are pretty tied by Execute, right? So of course, when you look at a long sustained phase of damage inside Bloodlust without the Execute possibility for warriors, they will be staying in the 11 to 14,000 range. If this were to be looked at in an Execute window, then the warriors, Fury a little bit lower than Arms, but the warriors would be jumping in the upper tier. They would be closer to Unholy and to Shadow Priest, reaching the 18,000 or so DPS window because of Execute. That is the extra we have to point out when it comes to the middle of the pack. Arms particularly is kind of an exception in there. Now the bottom. We left out 3 specs. The bottom 3, the ones that are even struggling to reach this 14,000 mark, are more sitting on the 10 to 12,000, very low, are Beast Mastery, Frost Mage, and Survival Hunter. Particularly interesting is the case of Frost Mage. Frost Mage is a very popular spec right now. It has completely overtaken Fire Mage. It is even more interesting because back in Season 1, Fire Mage was the exact opposite. Fire Mage had the strongest burst, among the strongest burst, and then instead now the most popular Mage spec has the weakest burst. That's pretty interesting. Frostmage, as always mentioned, doesn't have good burst damage. They have no options for burst. They have Icy Veins, which is consistent, okay? It's consistent damage. It doesn't change too much of what you're doing. Their Covenant is not bailing them out. Like I pointed out with Feral, they don't have Convoke the Spirits for Frostmage. They are Ventier. They have Mirrors of Torment, which despite having a 90-second cooldown is not really that powerful of a boost in terms of damage spikes. So they are there. Survival is another spec that has very little burst. Survival's cooldowns, like Coordinated Assault, basically the only cooldown they can use reliably, is not very powerful at all. Most of the survivals are Kyrian as well, so they have Resonating Arrow, but they don't have Wild Spirits for some extra burst, so it's also pretty disappointing. And then you have Beast Mastery that has even less burst than usual compared to Marksmanship, so they are bound to be even lower. The difference is still, however, kind of big compared to Marksmanship. Now, this is what we have for the moment in terms of burst windows inside of Bloodlust. Everything available, everything used, maybe even a rune, maybe even a Vantus Rune, everything, and this is the result. So, of course, besides the complete one-off of Ventier Balanced Druid, which is obscene, at the very least it takes a little bit more, a little bit more technique and thinking and thought to be able to pull it off. It's not just a brain-dead 3-button that gives you 30,000 DPS for free. At least you can risk completely fucking it up and triggering your raid leader for going Ventier as a Balanced Druid. Besides Balanced Druid, the rest is pretty smooth, going from the high 18s and 19,000, going down to 17, 16, and 15, and 14. It's also cool. It's cool and healthy that many of the popular specs don't really excel in this, even though this is very important. Single target burst sustained, single target in a short-ish window between 30 or so seconds is a pretty important phase you want to have, yet many of the popular specs don't necessarily excel in this. Of course, they will have to excel in other things, otherwise why are they popular? The case of Frostmage, for example, we just went over. There is also the case of Destruction Warlock, the case of Havoc, the case of Arms Assassination. So they will be good in other things, which we might look at in the future. We can look at the shorter burst windows, the 20-ish or so seconds, so I can make some of the specs excelling in that a little bit happy. And also when it comes to AoE. AoE, of course, is not as popular in raids. It's never been. Many of the times when you see AoE, the targets are gonna die in like 5 seconds or 10 seconds. Doesn't really matter who is the best. They're just gonna melt. So cleave is when it becomes a little bit more important, right? Fights like Ner'zhul, where you have to cleave down the orbs, is pretty important to 3-target damage them. Although they have been nerfed, now their health is 66% smaller, so they made it almost irrelevant. But later on, you have Soul Render, which does have some pretty important add damage, cleave damage you can have in that phase, and a few other fights later on where we will be able to see the value of multi-target damage in the encounters, and we will be able to compare all of the specs and how they do in that damage profile. But for now, we won't compare anything, because for now we can stop. As I am stretching in the back of my chair, we can say that this was an interesting video. I enjoyed making it because numbers are always cool. Checking out all of these different things, these different damage profiles and differences from Season 1 compared to what we have now. A few things have changed. So for me, it was enjoyable to make the video. I hope it was enjoyable to discover all of these new fun facts you have been just told. So, thank you guys for watching the video. If you want to support the channel, subscribe or don't. Yeah, that there is no other option actually. It's just two. Very simple. Either you do or you don't. Yeah, that's kind of true. See you guys soon. And in the meantime, I was trying to look at the burst for healers, but that was just way too complicated to figure out. I just gave up halfway through.